I suppose there's one key question really that we need to answer, given that we've been here under the aegis of a partnership, a research, health, consumer partnership, as outlined by Chris, by Ian, by Helena. How does it make a difference? How does it change that story? Elizabeth? You're the first. Yeah.
That was a bad choice of seats. Thanks, Norman. It was a spectacular performance, actually. It was quite heart-wrenching to watch the trauma associated. Very good actors. Look, from my perspective, compassion in healthcare is something that I do think sometimes we've lost. I have the misfortune as Secretary for New South Wales Health to read every reportable incident that comes through with adverse outcomes, and we do get quite a few complaints. And some of the things we do sometimes as a system does not make you proud. We do very good things, and as mentioned earlier by Helena, we have a very good health system. But my concern is we've just lost a touch of compassion in our desire to drive productivity, efficiency and get clinical outcomes, that we forget the human side of what we're doing. And that extends to the way we treat each other as health professionals. So I actually think the opportunities are enormous for us to collaborate in partnership with consumer groups and what the research is telling us, and to start reorienting our healthcare system a little bit to increase the compassion and really put patients at the centre, which was part of what I touched on yesterday. The patient outcome and the patient experience is absolutely foundational to what we need to do.
60% of chemotherapy occurs in the private sector. So we can talk all we like about what we're going to do in the public sector, but it misses out that 60% who get treated there. How do we, I know this is an interest of yours, Elizabeth, how do we bring in the private sector so that in fact any patient in New South Wales or Australia actually gets the same standard of care? Your view on that, Elizabeth?
Look, I think it's a complex question and there's no single answer. We've had the discussion about transparency of reporting, both in the public and private system, to start making some changes there. But I think the best way is to empower the consumer or the patient to start having a higher level of health literacy also, to understand what should be provided or what the best outcomes are. And the Cancer Institute in New South Wales is doing a lot of work in that domain, but it is problematic. And the other comment that I would make, that many of the clinicians who do work in the private sector do work in the public sector also. And having even discussions with Ramsay Healthcare and a few others when we've been talking about what makes a safe and high quality system and how we might work collaboratively to get better patient outcomes. Interestingly, the bigger corporates are viewing that patient outcome and patient experience, I think, as a bit of a sales advantage or a commercial advantage. But I think foundationally, the value of putting patients more at the centre of what they're doing can only be beneficial to the patients.
So, Karen, how do you think an advanced health research translational centre can make this story better?
I think that it can address some of the failures for what we saw. Educating doctors about how to communicate, I think, is crucial, and I think what we saw there was, from the first instance, a failure in communication. So the doctor was combative, the doctor didn't consider what it was that the patient needed. The first question really, once she said you've got cancer, should have been to the patient is, what can we do for you? What are your priorities? Allow the patient to express the position that they're in. There certainly wasn't informed consent. Again, it comes down to information, and hopefully if we teach doctors to communicate better, if we invest more money in ensuring that the information around informed consent is available and is available in appropriate format and is available verbally, written, on other sources, would have really helped the patient. Even really basic things like being confronted with asking your name, even though your name is there in front of you. And I know, as an experience as a patient, is that that's a security measure, that they need to keep checking your name. Now, had the receptionist, when she asked her name, said, look, I know that we already have these details, but we just need to run this through for a security measure to make sure we've got the right person, then it doesn't annoy you so much. I mean, in the heart transplant unit, you get asked your name probably 10 times a day by people who know you really, really well. But once you understand that it's actually an important issue, it becomes less annoying. So again, it's good communication can overcome a lot of the aggravation that's caused.
But you don't need a fancy collaboration called Sphere to do that, or Monash Health Partners, or Sydney Health Partners.
No, but we need effective change in the way that we train doctors. And if it takes a big collaboration like this to actually make that change, then let's bring it on, because we've been trying now for decades to change it and we haven't changed it. So we really need to bite the bullet and do whatever it is we need to do to change it. And, you know, if everybody's reading from the same book, maybe that's what it takes to change it.
So Helena, you know, Stephen Sewell didn't get this, the writer did not get this out of thin air. You know, $40,000 is not an unusual sum of money to be out of pocket for cancer care. It is not unusual to be in a cancer unit which is lousy at clinical trial recruitment, and you find yourself that if you've been just in another city and because there's no collaboration on clinical trials, they won't actually recruit you for another centre. I mean, and the whole private thing where it is, you've got some fantastic private cancer care centres here, Melbourne and elsewhere, but you do not know what happens behind closed doors, excess numbers of chemotherapies. It's a mess. And you're going to be judged, surely you should be judged on something like this of making it better.
Absolutely, and I think that that's the sort of call to arms that we need to look at how we change things. If I could just reflect for a moment on the scenario we saw, there was a complete lack of empathy, right from the receptionist to the radiographer to the doctor at every point. And clearly there are things we can do in the education system that are co-designed and that are more appropriate.
But you could live with lack of empathy if you got venetoclax from Peter McCallum.
Well, no, I'd like both. I'd like the empathy and the access to the new initiatives. But with the access to the new initiatives, that comes down to the silos in the system. And if we don't have platforms that allow us to make sure that the patient can find out about the trials that are there, and the clinical trial app that's now available in one of these centres is actually making a big difference to that. But if we don't have the systems that allow patients to drive finding out about those things and allow doctors to be able to make sure they know about them and they can also offer those opportunities.
But you can go, just sorry to interrupt, but you can go into the government's clinical trials registry and find out who are recruiting. You can go into clinical trial refer, and in a small haematology group, you can find out who shares patients. But that doesn't solve, the problem. That doesn't solve the problem, because you've got clinicians who do not collaborate with each other and jealously guard their own research projects. How are you and your partners in this going to change that culture?
The answer is not simply, as in there's not a simple way to do it. And all I can suggest is that you cannot do it one by one at the coalface. You can change one person's perspective, but one by one we will not win. But together we can have a much bigger impact, and we can create incentives which do change behaviour. It's not just about education incentives. I'm perhaps slightly less worried about the literate patient who will be able to empower themselves very soon. They will be empowered in ways that we can't imagine, with the whole raft of platforms that will give them a lot more information to be empowered. I'm worried about the refugee, illiterate, innumerate person, because a health system is judged by those who are most disadvantaged and the care you provide them. And a lot of what we're talking about at a high level without significant systems change might allow the most educated and the most elite and the most wealthy to navigate the system. It won't allow the most disadvantaged, and our gap will widen. So I think with a very strong focus on patient empowerment, and I really support that, but I also think there's that custodian responsibility on the system, and part of educating the doctors is making them accountable and responsible for looking after the system. If I can give you one example, I went to a phenomenal institute, which is a public hospital that has 8,000 beds in one of the most poor countries in the world, developing countries. And I walked through a ward of endocrine patients, and they had computers by the bedside, and they had just administered a drug called lutate, which is a $4,000 drug that I actually can't get access to in Australia. And I understand why I can't get access to it. Because the moment I get access to it, I can't treat the rest of my patients with actually drugs I need for more effect. In other words, it's a very, very small increment of benefit for a great deal of cost. And I said to the lead clinician, how can you justify using that medication in this system when you don't have any nurses on your ward? All the people looking after your patients are out camping in the grounds. Their food's made by them. You know, how do you justify it? He said, but I do the best for the person who's in front of me right now because that's my job. And if we leave this system up to the individual clinician, that's what they're going to argue. I do the best for the person in front of me most of the time, on contradiction to what we just saw. And I said to him, surely you look after obstetrics here because that's the biggest bang for your healthcare buck. He said, no, we don't. The obstetrics is over there. And there was the slum with no water and no electricity and untrained healthcare attendants. They did not have a health system. So what they ended up with was much more troublesome than ours. So I am a very, very strong believer that if you bring everybody to the table, you have a joint perspective. It's not just policymakers, it's not just consumers, it's not just universities, it's not just industry. And we work together, we will have to come up with better, more accountable ways of doing things. That won't be a simple solution, but there'll at least be multiple perspective solutions that will have to be better than what we have now.
And what if you were hypothetically confronted with a situation where, which is say in India or China, but particularly India, where they just ignore IP rights and produce their own generics at a tiny fraction of the cost? Because one of the problems here is cost and gouging by the pharmaceutical industry. So is there an advocacy position of these partnerships that we should actually break IP and take cheap generics from India?
So at least in my...
Because that's the issue, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's part of
If
that.
it was cheap...
The other problem is in India, they often don't contain the active product, but yes. I'm not going to give you an answer to that necessarily, except to say that it's not the highest radar for our centre right now, and maybe it needs to be. But one thing I can suggest, and I found yesterday morning's talks made me feel very uncomfortable. And one of the reasons for that is we're putting industry up and we're talking about innovation and we're saying, go and do these things, and assuming that they're going to create these high-cost products that are going to be of benefit to us. We're allowing industry to start. We're allowing the tail to wag the dog. Why aren't we coming together and saying the most important thing... Thank you. Why aren't we coming together and saying the most important thing is to work out what's most important, go along that journey, bring industry and capital venture in when we need it to do what we need to do together, not allowing industry to go out there and do what they want and then pitch us a small incremental benefit for major cost. And really, I think that's what we can do, is to change the system so that the research dollar, the investment, the system starts with a community and starts with the people who care and doesn't start with a competitive industry-driven, including precision medicine, and including genomics. If you ask the community what's the most important thing to them, if you ask our centres what our biggest priority is to fix the health system, it is not genomics.
Mary Gleeson, you've been, John Mattick would be turning into a sort of steamy ball here, but he's like, Mary Gleeson, you've probably been wrangling health researchers, medical researchers, health services longer than anybody on this table, and that's not a reflection of your age, it's just your experience of doing it, particularly in quite an integrated system in the Hunter Valley. What's your reflection on how to make this different?
The first thing that came to mind is having just been through a similar pathway with two researchers who reflect the journey that's just happened, that it was very confronting, but nobody bothered to ask the very important question right at the front: what did the patient want? And that's probably one of the biggest system changes that we've got to change the behaviour on. But I was also thinking about the access
Hold on, just interrupt that a second. sometimes you get the answer, not everything, I want to be left alone to die at home, and that's but some patients will say, I want the venetoclax from Melbourne, thank you very much, at $10,000 a month, or whatever it is.
And I think coming from a regional centre, I'll speak on regional, rural and remote access to clinical trials is even harder for people who live in Sydney and Melbourne. So you can add to that cost of giving the drug, and the impost on the public or the private health system is the impost on the person and the carers who have to bring the people to Sydney or Melbourne. So there has to be a change in the system for that at some point in the way we deliver to care in regional, rural and remote centres. So the Centre for Innovation in Regional Health has been given that responsibility of part of this national alliance to really ensure that the frameworks we come up not only work in our capital cities, but work for all Australians. So that's a real challenge. But to answer your question, it's a behaviour change that has been refreshing for me to come in as the interim director on this centre, because it's the first time in my professional career of both health service, health policy and health research that I've seen a national collaboration where we're not competing with each other, and we're saying that making change in the way we deliver health services has to be not competitive. We have to collaborate for the benefit of all Australians. And it's refreshing for me.
It just trips off the tongue so easily. I'm trying to actually get to what it looks like on the ground. Elizabeth's willing to work with you, the LHDs, hospital, health and hospital services, hospital networks in Melbourne, all willing to work with you. But what does it look like? What difference does it make? I'm really struggling to see what happens.
This is the first time it's been health-led. So it's not led by the policymakers. It's not led by university academics. The whole RTECs and regional centres are health-led. So it's there to address the really important questions or the changes to the systems or the priorities that the Medical Research Future Fund has identified in their review. How do we work together across the whole of Australia to make those changes? And I think it was
That's my question.
There was one powerful take-home message from the very first meeting that we went to with NHMRC and the Department of Health that were looking after the Medical Research Future Fund. And it was, we were given the mandate to have 3 national priorities, and all 9 directors around the table said, we want a 4th one, and that 4th one, we want consumers and the community engaged in across the whole board, and we want them there from the start. So the start of the change is we're asking consumers and community what they want, but at each of our centres we're actually asking our health systems what are the really high priority things that they want changed as well. So it's not just us 9 directors sitting around a table thinking we know the knowledge or we know how to change the system. It's about identifying what's really important to Elizabeth, the top, the chief executives in the LHDs or area health services across the other states. It's about what's important to the key changes that we need to make on the ground to change the systems, to use our health data better, to improve our Indigenous health and engage our consumers and community in the redesign process.
Chris?
Look, I agree that. I agree with all that. I think the difference, coming back to your question about what can be done, what's the difference, what's the new potential, and to be fair to say, this is a relatively new construct, and we're obviously completely engaged in this. But the potential is that we have the connectivity that is exemplified by the fact that on our governing boards, on our councils, we have the key leadership in health, as Marie and Helena said, with hands on the steering wheel. We have the key leadership in academia at the table, working in partnership. And there's alignment of purpose. Now, the agendas that...
But do they have the targets clearly in mind?
We have targets, and there are...
But is this the target, changing the actual outcome on a tangible basis?
We are at a formative stage, and we are now just setting our strategy. We have 4 national systems level initiatives. One is exactly in this space. And we could decide on any number of priorities, and there's a process we are going to go through around priority setting, around building some national framework with a broad collaborative. It may well be bad behaviour, bad aesthetics. That may be something that we focus on. But we have to come up with a number of priorities, and we have to do that in an organised and appropriate way. But if I reflect on the issues we saw, which went from me for a bit of a laugh to pretty confronting, because I have seen it. It's very rare, I would say. Say to you, Elizabeth, this is really rare in the health system, but it happens. And you know, this is, as Maria alluded to, this is about role modelling the best behaviour and lifting the fantastic elements we have in health up. And
if I might contradict you,
right?
Unacceptable variation in access to care is not rare in our system. It's all too common.
Okay.
And that's at the core of the story. The emotion comes from the interaction, but at the core of the story is somebody who's not getting access to the best care.
Look, I was going to get on to it. So trials and experimental therapy access and embedding trials much more effectively in the activity of healthcare we are struggling. And we know this. And in this state and across the Alliance, this is a key initiative. This state in particular, the 3 centres in this state are working now with the Ministry and the Office of Health and Medical Research to roll out a statewide clinical trial strategy. And Sydney Health Partners have been working on this for some time. Sphere and New South Wales Regional are coming in, and this is a focus. And we have strategy developing, we have a framework to implement, and we have a lot of will and power there. So I think we can make a difference to our access to trials. At the moment, we are underperforming in that space.
Ben?
Okay, just a couple of points I'd like to make. I think that the new National Institute for Dementia Research is attempting to shift the paradigm a little bit in that we've trying to get people to actually collaborate in research rather than compete for research funding. But we also have some very good model organisations which I think we can learn a lot from. So I've been involved with the work of the Cognitive Decline Partnership Centre, which right from the outset in that centre, patients and the public, so that is people with dementia, carers and families who were members of Alzheimer's Australia's Consumer Dementia Research Network, were consulted about what they saw as the priorities for the research projects that centre should run. And Sue Curl, who was the director of the centre, always jokes about the fact that she put forward a lot of research proposals on the table and about 50% of them got chucked out by the patients and the public because they said, no, that's not relevant, we really should be focusing on these areas. So they have embedded in the culture of that partnership centre very effective involvement of patients and the public. So they have a person who is in a paid position to coordinate their involvement across all the work of the centre. There have been people like me sitting on the steering committees of all of the activities of the centre. So hopefully what comes out of the centre, which ultimately is designed to improve the lives of people with dementia and their carers, will contribute to improvements in the system. We have the new national guidelines for dementia care, which again, this is this little booklet, we were actively involved in producing that, and there was a lot of input from patients and the public, particularly which influenced the direction of that document. It incorporated the principles of dignity in care, and I think if everybody followed the principles of dignity in care, we wouldn't be seeing the sorts of scenarios we saw today. And we also have a consumer companion guide to that document. So this is a very powerful tool in the hands of people who are seeking medical care. They can look up what the best evidence is and they can actually ensure or at least point out that these are the sorts of things that they should be receiving. So
Thanks, Jane.
I think there's hope.
Good. Jenny Lang, you've worked for most of your life in an academic institution, University of New South Wales, and you're talking to Jenny Lang. Can you hear me?
It's a little bit muffled.
I know it's really hard. Okay, because I haven't got a microphone. Turn on this one. So I'll just come closer so you can hear me. Apologise. You've been working most of your life in an academic institution, University of New South Wales. You're now a health consumer, but taking a perspective on the partnerships that we've been talking about, how do you think they could make a difference? And what do they need to do?
I think partnerships are powerful. I believe that when we look at the complexity of the healthcare system and so many different parts of it working either in isolation or collectively, my sense is that partnerships are really going to be the framework that takes our system to a much higher level going forward. In universities, we're natural collaborators, and I think our researchers, they work with their colleagues around the world to address issues or common challenges.
But hold on a second. I mean, we're all singing Kumbaya here. I mean, really, partnerships take a lot of time and effort. There's a transaction cost. You've got to go to meetings. You've got to be in teleconferences, Skype calls, God knows what else. You know, you come with these bureaucratic documents, with all due respect to Helena, fantastic flow charts. Tell me what they do. What does the partnership actually mean? What does it achieve for the time and effort and money?
I think if we're just stepping back, looking at outcomes that are wonderful outcomes, I think being able to deliver those in a cohesive way that reduces duplication, removes silos, and provides what I believe we should be aiming for is a patient-centred, community-driven healthcare system that draws on the best of humanity to provide wonderful health outcomes for the community. From my personal experience, where the medical professionals work incredibly closely together, I'm being treated at the Kinghorn Centre at the Garvan Institute, and for me that is a microcosm of what I would love to see rolled out across the whole system, where the various teams work in order to give me as a patient the best outcomes and to map out a program that will ensure that I receive a good outcome in 2020. The further I move away from that core group of professionals who are supporting me, then I find the difficulties of the system start to kick in. And I think there are lots of opportunities where we could start to address those by looking at a different framework.
So Gary, measurement, clear outcomes, knock over whatever barriers we can to get there.
Yes. Well,
Thank you,
sorry.
Jenny. I mean, I was just summarising.
Yes, I didn't hear the question, so I'll do what a politician does and answer another one. I certainly think that you can see that working in a small specialised centre such as the Kinghorn, where you've got a multidisciplinary model going and a holistic approach. The challenge is to get that working across the whole system, and that's what I think the ARTEC regional health centres are trying to do. Now, we're an unproven hypothesis at this point. It's a great hypothesis. I think so far so good, but it will live or die on the success in engaging the consumers, the community, the stakeholders. And I think we've got to move away from thinking consumer engagement is putting a couple of people on your committees and start to think about how is this done in the big wide world right now. Now, one of the themes this morning was, with the wonderful session just before lunch, was they didn't really know me. I was an adolescent, Harriet said, or in the play, I'm not that sort of woman sort of thing. Well, hundreds of organisations actually know Sharon very well, and they know and they know Harriet very well. They know me very well. My phone knows more about me than my doctor does, or the health system knows even less. And I think there are answers to be that will lie in applying modern consumer marketing type techniques to segment our market, not just have one book which tells you how to treat one disease or one guideline, but actually to be able to not just segment your diseases down to individual characteristics, but actually see what this person wants given their mores, their culture, their understandings, their knowledge, their level of literacy. And my epiphany in that area came in Aboriginal health, where I was used to the kind of NHMRC paradigm where you have a brilliant idea and you write a grant, and if it's better than everyone else's ideas, you get funded. Whereas when we moved into Aboriginal health, it was, everyone said, oh, it's so slow, you've got to get the community permission, and then they've got their own separate ethics committee, and they've got all these other things. Well, all these other things are absolutely wonderful. You ask a better question, and if you get an answer, they're ready for it. They're ready to implement it, to translate it, because you're answering what they want. So I think if we can move into that domain, then we will really be making a contribution, which it is so hard for a particular sector of the health and academic community to do by itself.
Very quickly to answer your question, Norman, about whether we're actually doing anything. The answer is absolutely, because we come with a single voice. So we're already increasing accessibility for clinical trials quite dramatically. Sydney Partners Initiative has increased the recruitment into clinical trials quite significantly. But the sorts of things we can do, for example, the community and consumer engagement, is if we came up with a single recommendation across 78% of our health services and 95% of our health and medical researchers, that you cannot put in an application for any initiative, innovation or research without clear evidence you've engaged policymakers, community and consumer, and had everyone at the table, or you just can't play. That would change the way we do things. So those systems level cost nothing, and we can do it together.
Could you please join me in thanking our panel?